Maximilien Robespierre was one of the most powerful men in the world. He had sent hundreds to the guillotine and was solely responsible for the deaths of many more. So how did he get taken down? In 1793, Robespierre was at the height of his power. France was at war with most of Europe and there was an economic crisis, which meant that there were food shortages. This caused people to riot in the streets of Paris, and they stormed two of the biggest prisons in the city, the Temple and the Luxembourg, and freed all the prisoners. The government was in a panic because it looked like the prisoners were going to storm the Tuileries Palace where the royal family was being held. However, one man remained calm in this moment of chaos. That man was Maximilien Robespierre. He went out into the streets and spoke to the crowds, telling them to go home and that their grievances would be addressed. And amazingly, they listened to him, and they all just went home. And so now that things had calmed down, it was time for Robespierre and the other leaders of the Committee of Public Safety to decide what to do with those who had escaped from prison. Now, normally, if someone escaped from prison, they would be considered innocent until proven guilty. But these were not normal times. These were the times of the French Revolution. And so Robespierre decided that the best course of action would be to execute all the prisoners who had escaped. And so he wrote up a list of those who were to be executed, and he called for the king's reaction. And when he heard that Louis XVI had approved the death sentences, he smiled because he had set his trap. You see, Louis XVI had no choice but to approve the death sentences. If he didn't, then the revolutionaries in Paris would have stormed the palace and killed him and his family. But Robespierre knew that by making the king approve the death sentences, he would have proof that the king was still a supporter of the old regime. And with this proof, he could take down the king and end the French monarchy once and for all. A few weeks later, Robespierre stood before the National Convention and presented his case against the king. And as he spoke, he was so charismatic and so convincing that the deputies just sat there and listened to him. They didn't interrupt him. They didn't question him. They simply listened as he condemned the king and called for his execution. And after he finished speaking, they all voted in favor of executing the king. However, as Louis XVI walked to the guillotine, he turned around and looked at Robespierre and said, "You may kill me, but you can never take away my revenge." And right before he got his head chopped off, Louis XVI told everyone to remember the words that he said, because they would soon come true. Now, up until this point, Robespierre had done nothing wrong. He had followed the rules. He had made sure that the king was fairly tried. And then he had presented his case to the National Convention, and the deputies had voted in favor of executing the king. But now things were going to change. You see, now that the king had been taken care of, Robespierre wanted to take care of anyone else who was a threat to the revolution. And that meant taking down his enemies. Now, normally, if someone was a threat to the revolution, they would be put on trial and then either executed or imprisoned. But again, these were not normal times. These were the times of the French Revolution. And so Robespierre decided to just get rid of them without a trial. One day, Robespierre and his allies passed a law that stated that any enemy of the revolution would be executed without a trial. And then they used this law to take down anyone who opposed them. They took down generals who lost battles because they said that those generals were traitors. They took down deputies who criticized them because they said that those deputies were counter-revolutionaries. And they even took down some of the leaders of the Jacobins because they weren't loyal enough to the committee. At first, the people of France didn't say anything. They just watched as Robespierre and his allies took down anyone who opposed them. But then the Girondins started speaking out against Robespierre and his allies. The Girondins were a political party that had been in power before the committee, and they accused Robespierre of being a dictator. They said that he was taking away the rights of the people, and that he was plunging France into chaos. And to prove their point, they pointed to the fact that since the committee had taken over, France had lost several major battles, and that the country was on the verge of bankruptcy. Robespierre responded by saying that the Girondins were trying to bring down the revolution, and that they were working with the enemies of France. and he used this excuse to take down even more of his enemies. Soon, the only people who could speak freely were the ones who supported Robespierre. France had become a dictatorship, and the only political party that was allowed to exist was the Jacobins. But not everyone in the Jacobins supported Robespierre. In fact, there was a group of young Jacobins who were known as the Incorruptibles. The Incorruptibles were led by a man named Georges-Jacques Danton. And while he had been one of the leaders of the revolution in the past, Robespierre had taken down many of his friends and family members. So now Danton was looking for revenge. Danton and his allies started speaking out against Robespierre, saying that he had become too powerful and that he was taking away the rights of the people. However, Robespierre ignored them, thinking that they didn't have enough power to do anything. But he was wrong because the Incorruptibles had a secret weapon. You see, Robespierre had made so many enemies over the years that there were plenty of people who hated him, including some of the leaders of the committee. So Danton and his allies went to these people and asked them for their support. And surprisingly, they got it. Now, Danton and his allies didn't want to kill Robespierre. They just wanted him to lose power. So what they did was they leaked a letter that Robespierre had written years ago. In the letter, Robespierre had said that the revolution wasn't about taking down the monarchy or ending the death penalty. It was about taking down his enemies and becoming the most powerful man in France. When the people of France read this letter, they were shocked. They had supported Robespierre because they thought that he was a selfless man who just wanted to help the people. But now it seemed like he had been lying to them all along. So with the support of the people, Danton and his allies went to the committee and demanded that Robespierre be arrested. But Robespierre was prepared for this. You see, when he had arrested the Girondins, he had made sure to place his allies in key positions throughout the government. And so now he used his allies to arrest Danton and his allies. However, this didn't stop the people of Paris from rioting. They stormed the palace and demanded that Danton and his allies be released. And in the end, their demands were met. Realizing that he had lost the support of the people, Robespierre tried to flee, but he was caught and taken to the guillotine. As he stood there waiting for his turn, he looked at the crowd and saw that many of the people who had cheered for him in the past were now booing him. And as he got his head chopped off, he realized that he had finally met his match. Louis XVI had been right. Robespierre couldn't take away his revenge. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content. Thanks for watching. Robespierre was one of the most influential figures in the French Revolution, but he also made plenty of enemies along the way. And so it's not really surprising that by the end of 1793, he found himself in prison awaiting his own execution. So why did people turn on him? Well, we can point to several reasons for his downfall. First up is that old chestnut power. In this case, though, it's more accurate to say too much power, too little power, and then some more power. Now, if you're thinking, hold up, wasn't Robespierre a leader of the revolution? Well, yeah. But here is where things get a bit complicated because there were actually three different kinds of power at play during the revolution. There was the power of the people, the power of the convention, and the power of the masses. And Robespierre excelled at wielding two of these three forms of power, but he failed to master the third. Let's start with the power of the people, which in revolutionary France meant the power of the sans-culottes, those working men who formed the backbone of the revolution. It was these sans-culottes who stormed the Bastille on July 14, 1789. Who forced King Louis XVI to flee the Tuileries Palace, and who even compelled the National Assembly to pass many of its key decrees. The sans-culottes were an unruly bunch. They craved liberty, equality, and fraternity, sure, but they also demanded immediate and total gratification. You see, these were the same folks who just a few years earlier had been getting drunk at taverns on the cheap wine known as Révolution while debating the merits of storming the Bastille. And by the time their grievances were finally addressed, they quickly developed new ones. With unemployment rising, food shortages becoming endemic, and the cost of living skyrocketing, the Sans-Culottes became increasingly radicalized, adopting violent rhetoric and even forming militias of their own to protect their interests. And Robespierre proved very adept at channeling their frustrations. A lawyer by trade, Robespierre possessed an oratorical talent that could turn a phrase like nobody's business. He knew how to frame events in a way that would rouse the passions of the crowd. And he could do it with a level of polish and panache that intimidated even his fellow deputies. In fact, it was Robespierre's impassioned speeches in defense of the Sans-Culottes that won him the nickname the Incorruptible. And that moniker helped propel him to the leadership of the Committee of Public Safety in April 1793. But while Robespierre was masterful at mobilizing the people, he would prove less capable at managing their expectations. You see, while he could whip up revolutionary fervor like nobody's business, he was less able to deliver on the economic front. And that's where the second kind of power comes into play, the power of the convention. The convention, of course, referred to the National Convention, an elected body that served as the legislative and executive branch of the revolutionary government. While the Sans-Culottes wielded tremendous influence over the convention, the latter was hardly a rubber stamp. It boasted a wide variety of factions representing different interests and ideologies, from the Girondins to the Jacobins, from the Plain to the Feuillants. And these factions were often at loggerheads over policy, making the convention the site of heated debates and fierce political struggles. Robespierre, despite his oratorical skills, wasn't particularly adept at this game of legislative musical chairs. He simply didn't have the broad base of support necessary to push through all of his ambitious projects. For instance, in late 1792, he tried to persuade the convention to declare war on European powers, but failed due to a lack of support. In February 1793, he attempted to ban all counter-revolutionary organizations, but again failed. To win such legislative battles, he needed allies. And so Robespierre reached out to the Girondins, a moderate Republican faction whose influence over the convention should not be underestimated. This alliance proved successful. After all, it was the Girondins who backed Robespierre's bid to lead the Committee of Public Safety. But it was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it gave him access to the Girondins' considerable resources. On the other hand, it brought him into conflict with the Jacobins, the far more radical left-wing party. The Jacobins criticized the Girondins for being out of touch with the masses. And when Robespierre aligned himself with them, he acquired powerful new enemies. And when the Girondins eventually fled the convention in June 1793, it was clear that Robespierre had made a serious miscalculation. This brings us to the final source of power, the power of the masses. Now, while Robespierre was quite skilled at mobilizing the Sans-Culottes, he failed to keep them on his side. See, by mid-1793, the Sans-Culottes were getting tired of talk about counter-revolutionaries and foreign threats. They wanted bread and jobs and a return to the pre-revolutionary social order. And the Jacobins under Robespierre were promising exactly that. However, Robespierre soon found that he couldn't live up to these expectations either. His attempts to curb the violence of the revolution through the law of 20 to Prairial only antagonized the Sans-Culottes further, as did his decision to execute Queen Marie Antoinette in October 1793. Indeed, by the time the Revolutionary Tribunal began issuing indictments against the Girondins in January 1794, public opinion had completely turned. And when the Sans-Culottes stormed the palace on 9 Thermidor II, seizing Robespierre and his allies and hauling them off to the guillotine, they were merely acting on the will of the people. Now, before we wrap things up, let us take a brief interlude to examine why Robespierre was ultimately unsuccessful in achieving any of these goals. Now, this is something of a tricky question because Robespierre was an extremely talented politician, arguably one of the most talented to ever grace the French stage. And yet he failed to achieve any of his more grandiose objectives. Why was this? Well, part of the problem was that he sought to achieve too much. Robespierre had big dreams for France, dreams of a nation transformed by virtue and equality. a nation that would serve as a shining example of liberty and democracy to the whole world. But he was simply trying to do too much, both legislatively and personally. Consider that Robespierre's program for the revolution included ending the monarchy, reorganizing the economy, reforming the legal system, abolishing slavery, and winning foreign wars. It was an incredibly ambitious agenda, and one that no single individual could hope to realize. Moreover, Robespierre also attempted to suppress the revolution's violence while simultaneously encouraging its growth. Remember, while he is infamous for having citizens guillotined, Robespierre also presided over a massive expansion of the franchise, and he believed that universal male suffrage, as well as the abolition of slavery, would help tamp down revolutionary fervor, but these two aspects of his legacy are completely contradictory. By expanding the electorate, Robespierre was actually increasing the pool of potential sans-culottes. And by abolishing slavery, he deprived the colony of Saint-Domingue, a colony that was producing coffee, sugar and cotton that was worth around 60 million livres annually, of millions of workers. This created a labor shortage that caused production to plummet and prices to soar. In the end, then, Robespierre's downfall was the result of trying to do too much and succeeding at nothing. He sought to harness the power of the people, the power of the convention, and the power of the masses, but ultimately failed to satisfy any of them, and as such, he paid the ultimate price. We hope you enjoyed this episode, with a special thanks to our supporters who make episodes like this one possible. Robespierre's speech of the 26th of July is one of the most fascinating speeches in history. It is such an intense speech that many historians have been debating for centuries whether or not Robespierre was having a psychotic break during this speech. We'll explore that question in this video. But first, we need to understand what this speech was about and how it led to Robespierre's arrest just days later on 9 Thermidor year 2, or in our calendar, the 27th of July 1794. So let's start with some context. When Robespierre gave this speech, he had been working with the Committee of Public Safety for over a year. And over that time, the committee had become a sort of parallel government to the official government, ruling France through emergency powers in the name of the revolution. The purpose of this was urgently to fight the war against the European coalitions, but then they also used it to suppress internal enemies of the revolution, especially those who opposed the radical phase of the revolution embodied by the Jacobins. This period is usually called the Reign of Terror. The problem from the perspective of the committee and the Jacobins was that they were losing the support of the people of Paris and, more importantly, the support of the National Convention. The main reason for this was that the terror was becoming too much. People started asking whether the revolution had gone too far. And the question was no longer if Robespierre would be arrested, but when. So Robespierre needed to do something big to turn the tide back in his favor. And that brings us to the revolt in the Vendée. The revolt in the Vendée was a royalist rebellion in the province of Vendée in western France. At its peak, it involved some 100,000 royalists fighting against the revolutionary armies. For the Jacobins, this revolt was like their worst nightmare come true. If the royalists were to win, then the revolution would be over and the monarchy would be restored. So the Committee of Public Safety threw all of its forces into suppressing the revolt. This meant that Robespierre got thrown into the middle of the Vendée as the leader of the military operations. However, the reality was that things were going badly there. Despite throwing tens of thousands of soldiers at the problem, the revolutionaries couldn't put down the revolt. So Robespierre ended up spending a whole month in the Vendée trying to figure out a way to end the revolt and save the revolution. When Robespierre returned to Paris, he wrote a report about how the revolt could be crushed and presented it to the National Convention. He also asked for permission to go to the Netherlands for a while to take a break and recuperate. But this request was denied, and instead, he was ordered to speak about the revolt in front of the National Convention. And that brings us to his speech of the 26th of July, which can be divided into two parts. First, he starts by talking about the revolt in the Vendée and why it's so dangerous. Then in the second part, he talks about the future of the revolution and what needs to be done. Let's start with the first part. In his speech, Robespierre talked about how the revolt in the Vendée was the most serious crisis that the French Revolution had faced since its beginning. He said that it wasn't just a revolt, but actually a foreign invasion. To make his point, he walked barefoot around the convention hall while talking and exclaimed, "Do you want to know who are our enemies? Look, look there, those who would deliver France to the foreigner, those who would ruin the work of the revolution." He also argued that the royalist rebels weren't just misguided peasants who didn't understand the revolution, but rather that it was a well-organized counter-revolution supported by France's enemies abroad, especially Great Britain. For Robespierre, this was all a part of a British plan to corrupt the revolution from within and destroy it. He said, "Everything in this conspiracy tends toward the same point, the downfall of the Republic. The eternal struggle between liberty and despotism, which now engages all the nations of the earth, has reduced the standard of our glorious revolution. The standard which England would fain dishonor and trample underfoot. Our enemies have declared open war against us." At this point, he pulled out a letter that he had allegedly received from a British general that proved, beyond any doubt, that Great Britain was supporting the revolt. In the letter, the British general explained how he had been bribing rebel leaders and sending them weapons, and how the goal was to use the royalist rebels as a diversion to attack France from the north. Then he went on to explain how the main reason that the revolt had almost succeeded was because the Committee of Public Safety had become too trusting of local leaders and hadn't sent enough troops to crush it. But Robespierre said that this wouldn't happen again, and that the counter-revolution wouldn't succeed. He told the deputies, "We must repel this invasion, or we shall fall ourselves with the revolution. Either we conquer or we perish. Let us choose the former fate." After making this, the speech turned to the second part, where he talked about the future of the revolution. He admitted that there had been some problems in the way the revolution had been managed, but he blamed it on external circumstances, especially the war. He said that the war had required strong measures to defend France, and that was why the Committee of Public Safety had become so powerful and had arrested so many people. But he admitted that perhaps the committee had kept too much power for itself and hadn't shared it enough with the other branches of government. He promised that this would change and that the revolution would enter a new phase now that the war was nearly over. He said, "The revolution will now be consolidated, order will be reestablished, the blessings of peace will return. A new government, the government of the useful and of right, will take its place. A government which shall not have as its watchword repression, but public instruction. We shall not be looked on as tyrants. No, no, we shall be considered as the founders of the new government." And that's pretty much it. That was Robespierre's last major speech before the National Convention. Just 8 days later, he would be arrested and sent to the guillotine. So why exactly did Robespierre lose the support of the National Convention? Well, for one thing, his speech was too little, too late. By the time he gave this speech, the convention had already decided that he had to go. They were looking for a scapegoat to blame for the excesses of the revolution, and Robespierre fit the bill perfectly. But there is another explanation for why Robespierre lost the support of the convention, and that's that he had a psychotic break during the speech. There are a few things that point in this direction. First, we have the famous story about him walking around the convention hall while talking and gesticulating wildly. Second, historians have noted how angry and animated he was while talking. Third, we have his body language. In a study published in 2022, researchers analyzed the postures Robespierre used during this speech and compared them with postures used by schizophrenic patients. They found that he used the same type of postures as schizophrenic patients. And lastly, there are the words he chose. Historians have noted how his speech contains weird and bizarre expressions that don't really fit anywhere. Here's one example. At one point he says, "You have seen the abyss which our enemies have dug for us. Do you want to throw yourselves into it? No." Oh, no, no, no. Why does he suddenly say, "Oh, no, no, no"? It doesn't really add anything to what he's saying. And here's another example. After showing the letter from the British general, he said, "This document is the historian of the conspiracy. It will be placed in the public archives of the nation so that every citizen may read and know the gratitude which we owe to the defenders of the fatherland. Why did he suddenly switch to talking in the third person? So could it be that Robespierre was having a psychotic break during this speech? Well, I think the answer is probably yes. But there is another possible explanation, and that's that this was a planned performance. Robespierre was known for being a very dramatic speaker. And in this speech, he combined that with a bit of acting to really sell his points. Remember that he literally walked around the convention hall while talking. That's not something that most politicians today would think of doing. Ultimately, we can't know for sure what was going on in Robespierre's mind when he gave this speech. But what we do know is that just 8 days later, he would be sent to the guillotine, ending the most radical phase of the French Revolution. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel. On this day, July 1794, the revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre was arrested along with several of his allies and brought before the very tribunal that he had helped establish, the Revolutionary Tribunal, and then sent to the guillotine. In today's episode, we'll find out why the Commune played a crucial role in bringing an end to the Reign of Terror and learning more about this pivotal moment in French history. But first, if you enjoy learning about historical events as they happen on this day, be sure to follow to get notifications for every new episode. So let's talk about the Paris Commune. If you're not familiar with it, the Paris Commune was a revolutionary government that briefly held power in Paris from March to June of 1793 during the French Revolution. It was established by radical Republicans after the fall of the Girondins, a moderate political faction who opposed the policies of the Committee of Public Safety. And we have an entire video about them that you can watch here. The Paris Commune was a key player in turning the course of the revolution towards more radicalism, and it also played a crucial role in Robespierre's rise to power. But as we've seen in our previous episodes, the Reign of Terror was not without its enemies. And as the revolution entered its more radical phase, there were growing calls for the abolition of slavery, the redistribution of land, and the establishment of a republic based on the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The Paris Commune was at the forefront of these demands, and they were suspicious of Robespierre's conservative views. In fact, in late 1793, when Robespierre tried to moderate the revolutionary government, the Commune actually forced him to flee Paris for a while. However, as the war with the European coalitions intensified and the threat of counter-revolution grew, the Commune realized that they needed Robespierre's help to save the revolution. And so they invited him back to Paris to form a new government. And although he was initially hesitant, Robespierre accepted and became the leader of the new government. But now he had to contend with the Commune, who were still suspicious of his conservative views. To appease them, Robespierre agreed to their demands for more radical reforms, such as the abolition of slavery and the redistribution of land. And this alliance between Robespierre and the Commune lasted until the summer of 1794, when Robespierre began to fear that the Commune was becoming too powerful. In fact, there was a growing rift between Robespierre and the Commune over the issue of the war with Austria. The Commune wanted to end the war with Austria and focus on domestic issues, but Robespierre wanted to continue the war. This tension eventually came to a head when Robespierre accused the Commune of being counter-revolutionary and disloyal to the revolution. And this led to his downfall and the eventual abolition of the Commune. Now, what happened exactly on July? Well, it all started a few days earlier when a group of royalist conspirators attempted to assassinate several leaders of the Committee of Public Safety, including Maximilien Robespierre. The plot failed, but it had a major impact on Robespierre's fate. You see, although he was not physically harmed in the attack, Robespierre's reputation was tarnished. In the aftermath of the attack, Robespierre and his allies, Saint-Just and Couthon, were arrested on July 9, 1794, along with several other suspected enemies of the revolution, including two members of the London Corresponding Society. It was a shocking turn of events because up until this point, Robespierre had been one of the most powerful and influential figures in France. He had been a leading member of the Committee of Public Safety since its creation in April of 1793, and he was largely responsible for the institution of the Reign of Terror. But as we mentioned, Robespierre had made powerful enemies during his time in power, both within and outside of the Committee of Public Safety. Some of his colleagues on the committee had long been suspicious of his methods and his power, and they were eager to get rid of him. Others saw the attempt on his life as an opportunity to finally get rid of their rival. Furthermore, Robespierre's political enemies, particularly those belonging to the Paris Commune, had been waiting for a chance to get rid of him. They accused him of being a dictator and of using the Reign of Terror to consolidate his power. So when news of the failed assassination attempt reached them, they saw an opportunity to strike a blow against Robespierre and his allies. In the end, it was a combination of factors that led to Robespierre's arrest. The failed assassination attempt provided the opportunity, but it was his political enemies who took advantage of it. They used the attempt on his life to turn public opinion against him and to convince the National Convention to arrest him and his allies. Now, as we said, Robespierre and his allies were arrested on July, but they were not immediately executed. Instead, they were brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal, which was a court established by the Committee of Public Safety to try those accused of crimes against the revolution. However, everyone knew that this was just a formality and that Robespierre and his allies would be executed soon. And they were right. On July, the tribunal found Robespierre and his allies guilty of treason and conspiracy against the revolution and sentenced them to death. They were then taken to the guillotine and executed in front of a crowd of thousands. Now, this was a shocking turn of events because up until this point, Robespierre had been one of the most revered figures of the French Revolution. He was known as the Incorruptible because of his commitment to the ideals of the revolution. And he had played a key role in the overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of the Republic. But his enemies wasted no time in tarnishing his reputation. In the days following his arrest, they spread rumors that he had been plotting with the enemy and that he had betrayed the revolution. And this propaganda campaign was successful because it turned public opinion against Robespierre. And although he had been a hero to many, there were also many who saw him as a tyrant and a dictator. And so it was that Maximilien Robespierre, the man who had been one of the most powerful and influential figures in France, met his end at the guillotine. In fact, the execution of Robespierre marked a turning point in the French Revolution. It brought to an end the Reign of Terror and ushered in a period of more moderate rule. The execution was also a major blow to the Jacobins, a political club that Robespierre and his allies belonged to. The Jacobins had been a major force in the revolution, but they were now on the decline. And although the French Revolution would go on for several more years, the execution of Robespierre is often seen as the end of its radical phase. Alright, now we want to hear from you. What do you think? Why did Robespierre's allies in the Paris Commune turn against him? Was the execution of Robespierre a necessary move to end the Reign of Terror? Or was it a mistake? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to follow if you haven't already and join us next time as we continue our journey through history.